I was on a farm in central Kansas earlier this week just talking about the farm economy, and one farmer told me farmers don't have a commodity price problem. Farmers have a margin problem, and one of the biggest issues creating that problem, input and fertilizer prices today. As farmers know all too well, those prices rose sharply in 2021, and from crop inputs to machinery, those prices really never came back down. So what's the root of the issue, and why are input prices, particularly fertilizer prices, so high? That's this weekend's Farm Journal report. Just last week on Capitol Hill, lawmakers took to task an issue farmers have long wanted answers for.
Over the last 20 years, a few big companies have bought up many of the smaller seed and chemical businesses.
The hearing was titled Pressure Cooker Competition Issues in the Seed and Fertilizer Industries. It was orchestrated by the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that issue drew emotions from both sides of the aisle.
What's happening in America is dire. Congress must not just talk about the problems, we've got to fix them, or American farming as we know it will be forever changed.
The point of the hearing was to uncover forces driving the soaring costs of inputs and identify practical steps to restore competition. And of the 6 witnesses who provided testimony that day, 2 were farmers.
If the market becomes too constricted, it is ultimately the farmer who loses. Fertilizer pricing has become very volatile, with at times wild swings in cost varying as much as 25 to 50% from year to year.
Farmers are paying more than ever to grow their crops. In just 5 years, seed prices have increased by 18%, fertilizer by 37%, pesticides by 25%, machinery by 23%, and interest expense by 37%.
But it wasn't just farmers. Corey Rosenbush, president and CEO of the Fertilizer Institute, was there to represent the fertilizer industry. Rosenbush speaking to AgriTalk's Chip Flory this week on his view of the fertilizer landscape.
It's a challenging time for growers, and I think in some cases it's even harder for the American farmer right now than it was a few years ago. When we saw some of the really explosive markets take off, because at that time, at least, commodity prices were high.
Rosenbush stood his ground, saying it's global forces that are to blame for much of the squeeze.
The factors that are driving this market are frankly outside of our control and honestly outside of this country's control. Geopolitics this time is taking the headlines when it comes to driving supply-demand factors.
Russia's war in Ukraine, China's export restrictions, and energy volatility all ripple through fertilizer markets. But while Rosenbush points to geopolitics, farmers see a deeper structural problem, and that's too few suppliers and not enough competition today.
The bottom line is that we don't have many places to get our inputs from. I mean, I might have a half a dozen retailers in Bremer County, but when you go a little bit farther, they pretty much get all their phosphorus from one company. They get all their potash from 2 companies. They get all their nitrogen from maybe 3 companies. And I'm talking about fertilizer, but the same problem exists in the seed industry.
Iowa farmer Mark Mueller was supposed to represent the Iowa corn growers during the hearing. He says he was disinvited, and he thinks it's because of how outspoken Iowa corn has been on the lack of competition in fertilizer today. But he still attended the hearing in person, and listening to all the testimonies, he says there was one comment that really stood out.
The most disingenuous statement I heard in the entire time came from the CEO of the Fertilizer Institute, that there are 20 unique companies that supply fertilizer inputs to the industry. Now, I would say that's kind of like General Motors saying they're actually made up of 4 or 5 unique companies, Buick, Chevrolet, GMC, and Cadillac, it's all one company.
In your opinion, Josh, is there enough competition in the fertilizer industry today?
Here's why I can't be a politician. No. Simple answer. No. And I wouldn't say it's a monopoly. It's an oligopoly. When you look at nitrogen, there are 3 players that control the vast majority of production. When you look at phosphate, there's one main player out there.
From tariffs and countervailing duties to even threats of new sanctions on Russia, Linville says U.S. policy is inflating prices that global trade already pushes up. And another wild card that could keep fertilizer prices high, the reported farmer tariff aid payments that could be coming from the White House.
I am taking more of the approach of if the payments come out, I'm afraid it's going to boost fertilizer prices. It doesn't change the S&D for most of these products, but what it does is it changes the timing. Let's say we've got demand that's spread out from now all the way until spring season. If there's a big fat check that goes into the farmer's pockets and that gets spent on fertilizer, and you pull all that demand into one period.
What are the chances that we could see fertilizer come down before spring, Josh?
It's going to be very difficult. I think that's the best way to put it. You look at nitrogen. Yes, we've made some improvements. China's exporting a little bit more. Russia's exporting a lot more. We've got some peace in the Middle East, but we've still got production problems in places like Europe, and China's all of a sudden slowing down their export rates. There's still problems there. When you look at phosphate, simply put, China is going to cut their exports in half this year to keep their tons at home, and the world doesn't have somebody to back up and fill in that gap.
Linville doesn't see much chance of short-term relief, but is there a different way to bring fertilizer prices down? That's exactly what Chip Flory asked the Fertilizer Institute this week.
If we would just stop exporting and start stockpiling instead, would that be something that would bring some price relief to producers?
It still does not change the fact that we have to import 40% of our phosphates. And so that's going to be the big driver. We're kind of price takers when it comes to what the price of phosphate is. And even if we did want to, take a page out of the Chinese book and just say no more exports, we're going to keep it locally, we don't have the infrastructure to stockpile.
In what's being called a victory for America's farmers and fertilizer industry, the Trump administration this week making phosphate and potash, 2 of 10 additional minerals now deemed critical. It's a move that could help speed up mining permits and encourage U.S. investments. This is something industry leaders were also pushing for in the hearing. But if you ask farmers, they also need a quick fix, as fertilizer prices are one of the biggest pain points today. Now, to open the hearing, Senator Grassley called for the Trump administration to lower input tariffs on Moroccan phosphate, which he argued has hurt farmers. He says this is a problem the last administration didn't fix and says this could provide immediate relief for farmers, at least on phosphate. But Grassley also helped reintroduce the Fertilizer Research Act this year, a bipartisan bill that requires the USDA to conduct a comprehensive study of the fertilizer market and then publish a report on it that includes looking at competition and concentration. And Ag Secretary Brooke Rollins has said USDA and the DOJ will work together to take a hard look and scrutinize competitive conditions in the agricultural marketplace, particularly looking at inputs, including fertilizer, through antitrust enforcement. She actually sat down with Joe Vaclavic on his podcast this week, answering questions that farmers submitted. So what were Joe's biggest takeaways from that one-on-one? He joins us next.
U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by Fendt. 11 farms, 11 days, one ideal combine. The Fendt Harvest Tour is on. Tune in for real farmer stories during peak harvest season to see how the Fendt Ideal performs when every second counts.